been a day of celebration for Israelis with the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, but also a day of rage and tragedy for the Palestinians, with at least 52 killed by Israeli fire during violent protests at the Gaza border. Is the embassy move a justified diplomatic gesture that could bring peace closer, or a diplomatic misstep that will only spark more violence?
Right. A lot of these questions are in the air. The debate will be from here in the studio to Washington. But first, let's hear what we just heard from the White House press briefing. They were asked about that violence in Gaza today, how the White House sees it. Here's what they said.
The responsibility for these tragic deaths rests squarely with Hamas. Hamas is intentionally and cynically provoking this response. And as the Secretary of State said, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Well, to discuss this issue, in studio with us, Arsen Ostrovsky, Executive Director of the Israeli Jewish Congress and an international human rights lawyer. But first, let's go to Washington and speak with Omar Baddar, Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute. And Omar, let me just start with what we just heard. The White House basically taking the side of Israel following the events in Gaza. Certainly a very different reaction from what we heard from previous administrations, certainly the Obama administration. Let me get your reaction.
You know, Gaza is one of the few places in the world where the victims are actually blamed for their own deaths. You know, this is the only conflict in the world where the people who are actually doing the shooting at the demonstrators are somehow absolved from killing them. But frankly, the people in Gaza have been besieged for far too long. They're living in squalid conditions. More than 90% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable, and that situation is simply unjust, and people acting out against it after Israel has made it clear that it has no intention of ever giving them freedom. The fact that they're protesting to break out of that open-air prison is perfectly legitimate, and if you look at the reports from human rights organizations, they are absolutely outraged by Israel's behavior, which is opening fire on unarmed demonstrators and killing so many so far. Just the numbers are absolutely horrific.
Arsen, we saw those numbers he's talking about. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, 55 killed, about 40,000 people estimated to have made it to the border for those protests. Do you think that Israel could have done something differently today to avoid that tragic consequence?
If anyone could have done something different to avoid it, it would have been Hamas by not calling for mass riots. We have to put this in context. This was no peaceful protest. This was 50,000 people on the border, spurned by Hamas, driving them there literally in buses. You have to remember also, who is Hamas? Hamas is a terrorist organization sworn to our destruction. They were there throwing Molotov cocktails, trying to detonate bombs. Any country in Israel's position would have done the same to try and stop people trying to infiltrate our border. Simple as that.
Okay, Omar, I want to just shift the discussion to the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. We did hear the administration officials. We heard Jared Kushner saying that this step will actually help move the peace process forward, or move toward a peace process. I'd like to get your response to that.
It's an absolutely absurd proposition. You know, frankly, the move of the embassy is politically stupid. It's, when it comes to international law, it's unlawful, and it's also morally indefensible, and it's definitely moving us farther away from the prospect of peace. You know, the problem has always been the lack of sufficient American pressure on Israel to get more serious about ending the occupation of the Palestinian territories, and those include East Jerusalem. And you heard in Netanyahu's speech today, he made no distinction between East and West Jerusalem. He said there will be an undivided Jerusalem that remains under Israeli control, and he referenced Israeli control over Temple Mount, which is in East Jerusalem, and that is what is actually being celebrated. So we're actually moving away from the prospect of ending the occupation and recognizing any Palestinian rights. So that's incredibly counterproductive. And frankly, it's really cynical and almost a slap in the face of anybody who actually pays attention to the details and knows what the problem has been all along.
Arsen, in what way could this actually help the peace process move forward? Because not only have they said Jerusalem is off the table, but this administration also says that the final status of Jerusalem is still up in the air. Some mixed messages from Washington.
Any foundation for peace is based on truth. Simple as that. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, as the administration has said, is a simple acknowledgement of fact. We don't need it as Israelis to know that Jerusalem is our capital. We know that. But the Palestinians need to know that. We have had multiple U.S. administrations from across the political spectrum with different policies, different different offers on the table, including different ways to divide Jerusalem, but each time the one constant has been Palestinian rejectionism. So there needs to be an understanding that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and once the Palestinians understand that, once they stop delegitimizing and trying to reject any kind of Jewish connection to Jerusalem, perhaps then there might be a foundation for peace.
Omar, what do you say to that, and to the also another reality that the Israeli government is in Jerusalem? Diplomats that always stay, or almost always stay in Jerusalem when they're conducting diplomacy with Israel, and that this really isn't that much of a change in what was already the maybe unconfirmed status quo.
Well, just on the first part, you know, it's almost comical, actually, to suggest that it's Palestinian rejectionism that is the problem, given the fact that Netanyahu has been pretty open about the fact that he rejects the possibility of the creation of a Palestinian state. And throughout the so-called peace process, all that happened is that Israel kept expanding settlements more and more throughout the Palestinian territories, making a Palestinian state basically impossible to bring about. That's the denial. You know, it's not so much about rhetoric, it's about who's actually denying, who's making a two-state solution impossible on the ground, and that party has been Israel all along. As far as recognizing reality, you know, this administration here has also instructed its State Department to stop using the word occupation, denying the reality that the Palestinian territories are occupied by the State of Israel. So this is not really about recognizing reality. At the end of the day, this is about the U.S. administration under Trump joining Israel's war against the Palestinian people to deny them their rights. You know, if Trump had come out and said, we're going to have an embassy in West Jerusalem for Israel, but we also consider East Jerusalem to be occupied, and we're going to open an embassy there for the Palestinians, and Israel must end the occupation of East Jerusalem, then that would have been a fair and even-handed process. But right now, given Israel's denial of Palestinian rights and essentially the ongoing project of displacement that Israel is engaging in now, with new laws that are being passed to strip citizenship away from residency away from Palestinians living in Jerusalem and so on. This is actually a war that the Trump administration has joined against Palestinians.
Arsen, we just had some breaking news. The South African government has announced it's withdrawing its ambassador from Israel, this over the incidents in the Gaza Strip. And I want to ask you if the events in the Gaza Strip, especially since they show no signs of easing, in a sense perhaps undercuts the Netanyahu government's diplomatic triumph in Jerusalem today.
Look, in terms of South Africa, I think we've seen a slippery slope from them for some time now. They have taken increasingly extremist positions, so this doesn't come as a huge surprise. But at the end of the day, I think we're also seeing increasingly more nations, both from Europe, Africa and elsewhere. There's a UN Security Council meeting today, reiterating not only that, yes, the people in Gaza are entitled to protest, but they must protest peacefully, and that Israel has a legitimate right to self-defense. So that's an important point to bear in mind, and I think we're seeing more nations reiterating that and condemning Hamas.
Omar, what about that? Because we did see the European Union give a statement that was perhaps not as critical as Israel as it would have been in the past. That may be the influence of some Eastern European countries. And we see Latin American nations also moving their embassies. Are the Palestinians losing the diplomatic battle here?
I don't think that's the case at all. Frankly, if you look at the world's reaction when Trump first announced that he's going to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the UN vote was absolutely lopsided when it comes to the General Assembly. Massive numbers of countries on one side rejecting this illegal move, and a few that are actually siding with the U.S. after being bullied by the U.S. administration, by Nikki Haley at the UN, who are basically offered rewards, carrots and sticks if they did not vote along with the U.S. on this kind of stuff. So yeah, there are a few countries here and there that are basically willing to go along with this for their benefit, because they see a benefit in allying with the U.S. and Israel on an international stage. But at the end of the day, I think basically the movement against Israel's occupation is absolutely growing. You can see it in the boycott, divestment and sanctions on the grassroots level that's spreading all over the world.
Omar.
And frankly, in the consistent statements of so many countries that are not putting up with this anymore. They see it for what it is.
Omar, I just want to ask you, in the little time we have left, do you think that the Palestinian Authority, though, can realistically move forward, get anything done without the White House, whether they like the Trump administration or not?
They have to move forward without the White House. The White House has proved that it's not interested in playing the role of an honest broker. And frankly, any additional reliance on the United States is going to lead to nothing but more disappointment. I think it's time to internationalize this issue, to go to the United Nations, to the International Court of Justice, to the International Criminal Court, and try to find some accountability for Israel's behavior that does not depend on the United States.
All right. And as our correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim has been reporting over the last couple of weeks, that is indeed what they are planning, to internationalize further that conflict and a potential resolution. Omar, Baddar in Washington, Arsen Ostrovsky.